10. National Security Council. The National Security Council evolved from efforts begun in 1944 for the unification of the armed services and culminating in the National Security Act of 1947. Both the Council and its centralized intelligence coordinating sub-agency generally developed from the National Intelligence Authority Central Intelligence Group experience and a principal study of post-war defense organization matters prepared at the suggestion of Senator David I. Walsh, Democrat, Massachusetts, chairman of the Senate Committee on Naval Affairs, for Secretary of the Navy James V. Forrestal by New York investment broker Ferdinand Eberstadt. Footnote: see U.S. Congress, Senate, Committee on Naval Affairs, Unification of the War and Navy Departments, and Post-War Organization for National Security. Committee Print, 79th Congress, First Session. Washington, U.S. Government Print Office, 1945. End footnote. While numerous other reorganization ideas would follow, the Eberstadt report, quote, recommended the maintenance of 3 departments: War, Air, and Navy, with each having a civilian secretary, a civilian undersecretary, and a commanding officer. A National Security Council composed of the Secretaries of War, Navy, and Air, the chairman of the National Security Resources Board, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and a permanent secretariat would be established to facilitate interagency clearances. In the absence of the President, the Vice President or the Secretary of State would preside as chairman. The duties of the Council would be to exercise critical policy forming and advisory functions in the setting up of foreign and military policy. A central intelligence agency was to be made a constituent part of the Council's organization, with the Joint Chiefs of Staff serving as the principal coordinating unit. The latter would be given statutory authority permitting it to advise the Council on strategy, budgetary problems, and logistics. End quote. Footnote: Edward H. Hobbs, Behind the President, A Study of Executive Office Agencies. Washington, Public Affairs Press, 1954, page 129. End footnote. As initially established in 1947, the Council was an independent agency with a membership including the President, the Secretaries of State, Defense, Army, Air, Navy, and the chairman of the now-defunct National Security Resources Board, with the option that the chief executive might also include the heads of 2 other special defense units, now expired. 2 years later, the membership of the Council was overhauled to include the President, the Vice President, the Secretaries of State and Defense, the chairman of the National Security Resources Board, and certain other defense officials which the chief executive might specify as members, subject to Senate confirmation. Also, in accordance with Reorganization Plan No. 4 of 1949, the Council was formally located within the Executive Office of the President. 2 aspects of NSC organization and operation are of interest to this study: staff growth and activities and coordination mechanisms developed under the auspices of the Council. The general staffing pattern of the NSC would appear to be a movement from a small secretariat to a large, professionalized body competing with the bureaucracies of the defense and foreign policy agencies and departments for access to the President. The availability of the chief executive to the NSC staff has been enhanced by the decline of the Council's executive secretary and virtual replacement by a presidential assistant for national security matters. The creation of various coordination mechanisms reporting to the Council, where the chief executive presides, or directly to the President, has also increased the influence of this staff with the man in the White House. Under President Truman, who did not make extensive use of the panel, the NSC staff, quote, a small body of permanent Council employees and officers detailed temporarily from the participating agencies, was headed by a non-political civilian executive secretary appointed by the President. An anonymous servant of the Council, in the words of the first executive secretary, Sidney W. Sowers, a broker of ideas and crisscrossing proposals among a team of responsible officials, he carried NSC recommendations to the President, briefed the chief executive daily on NSC and intelligence matters, and maintained his NSC files, and served in effect as his administrative assistant for national security affairs. The organization of the NSC staff was flexible and, as the council developed, changed to meet new needs. In general, during the pre-Korean period, it consisted of three groups. First was the Office of the Executive Secretary and the Secretariat, composed of permanent NSC employees, which performed the necessary basic functions of preparing agenda, circulating papers, and recording actions. Next was the staff, consisting almost entirely of officials detailed on a full-time basis by departments and agencies represented on the council, and headed by a coordinator detailed from the State Department, who was supported in turn by a permanent assistant. This body developed studies and policy recommendations for NSC consideration. The third group consisted of consultants to the Executive Secretary, the chief policy and operational planners for each council agency. Thus, the head of the policy planning staff represented the State Department, the Director Joint Staff represented the Department of Defense, and so forth." End quote. Late in July 1950, President Truman ordered a reorganization and strengthening of the council. Attendance at NSC sessions was limited to statutory members and 5 other specifically designated officials: the Secretary of the Treasury, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Director of Central Intelligence, a Special Assistant to the President, W. Averill Harriman, and a Special Consultant to the President, Sidney W. Sowers, together with the Executive Secretary, James S. Lay, Jr. Footnote: by this time, the Council's statutory membership had been altered by a statutory amendment to the National Security Act of 1947, and the panel had been officially located within the Executive Office of the President. End footnote. Quote, the President also directed a reshuffling of the NSC staff. The permanent secretariat remained, but the staff and consultants were replaced by a senior staff and staff assistants. The senior staff was composed of representatives of State, Defense, NSRB, Treasury, JCS, and CIA, and shortly thereafter of Harriman's office, and headed by the Executive Secretary, an official without departmental ties. Members were generally of assistant secretary level or higher, and in turn designated their staff assistants. The senior staff participated closely and actively in the work of the Council. Not only did it continue the functions of the staff, but it also took over responsibility for projects formerly assigned to ad hoc NSC committees. It thus provided the Council with continuous support by a high-level interdepartmental staff group. The staff assistants, who did most of the basic work for the senior staff, spent a large part of their time in their respective agencies, where they could better absorb agency views and bring them to the fore during the developmental phase of NSC papers. The position of the Executive Secretary, moreover as chairman of the senior staff and also head of the permanent NSC staff in the White House, gave that official an intimate view of the President's opinions and desires that he could bring to bear quite early in the planning process. And finally, JCS and Treasury representation on the NSC staff filled needs that had been long felt." End quote. With the arrival of the Eisenhower administration, the Council was transformed into a highly organized and enlarged forum for the formulation of both national defense and foreign policy. Auxiliary coordination units were added to the NSC structure, and the panel's factual research and policy paper production was supervised by the first officially designated presidential assistant for national security matters, Robert Cutler. James S. Lay, Jr. continued as the Council's executive secretary. Footnote: Cutler's official title, first appearing in the Government Organization Manual for 1954, was Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, and was listed in both the White House office staff and National Security Council staff. Stress must be placed upon this being an official title, for certainly other presidential aides had been regarded as assistants for national security matters. Thus, one finds, for example, President Truman writing that when Admiral William D. Leahy retired as White House Chief of Staff in March 1941, I brought Admiral Sowers to the White House in the new capacity of Special Assistant to the President for Intelligence. Officially, Sowers was Executive Secretary of the NSC. Truman, page 58. End footnote. Most of this machinery disappeared in 1961, however, with the arrival of the Kennedy administration, and the NSC became but one of several means by which foreign policy and defense problems might be scrutinized. Quote, normally, the President assigned the preparation of a study or recommendation to a cabinet official or one of his top subordinates. This official, in turn, was responsible for obtaining other departmental views and checking and coordinating with other responsible individuals. Sometimes he did this within small interdepartmental groups, specially created to study the problem, sometimes by arranging for subordinates in each interested agency to develop the matter. Where appropriate, this included close consultation with the Budget Bureau. Fiscal matters were considered during the development of a study and in drawing up recommendations and proposals. Papers no longer had separate financial appendices. The completed report included not only the responsible official's own analysis and recommendations for action, but also a full statement of any differing views held by other agencies or individuals. This was true whether the report was prepared by one person or by a special task force. The final version, presented to President Kennedy at a formal meeting of the NSC or within smaller or larger panel or subcommittee meetings, was then discussed and, if necessary, debated further before the President made his decision. Once the Chief Executive approved a specific recommendation, the responsible agency or department made a written record of the decision, and the head of that agency, or a high-level action officer, was charged with overseeing its implementation. End quote. President Kennedy did not, however, discard the special assistant's role in council operations and national security matters. Quote, the special assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, McGeorge Bundy, also played an important role in the national security process. Not only was he a top presidential advisor, but as overall director of the NSC staff, he participated in all council-related activities. He and his assistants had a variety of responsibilities in addition to their normal secretariat functions. They suggested areas for consideration and the mechanisms for handling these and other problems, followed studies through the planning stage, and saw that they were properly coordinated, staffed, and responsive to the needs and desires of the President, ensured that a written record was made of all decisions, whether they were reached at formal NSC meetings or at other top conferences, and kept tabs on the implementation of whatever policy had been adopted. In this work, Bundy and the NSC staff coordinated closely with other parts of the presidential staff and the Budget Bureau, performed whatever liaison was necessary, and met frequently with the President at regular White House staff meetings. Formal NSC meetings were held often but irregularly, sometimes as frequently as 3 times a week, and usually at least once every 2 weeks. In the first half year of the Kennedy administration, for example, the Council met 16 times. Many matters that had been considered at regular NSC meetings under Eisenhower were now handled in separate meetings of the President with Secretaries Rusk and McNamara, or with a single cabinet officer, or in committees of the NSC that included only some of the statutory members, but also several of their top deputies or other government officials, or at meetings below the presidential level. End quote. While President Johnson largely continued to operate in much the same manner as his predecessor with regard to national security matters, President Nixon significantly altered these arrangements by vesting a great deal of autonomy in his assistant for national security affairs, granting that agent a large staff responsible to his personal supervision. The NSC Executive Secretary position remained vacant during the Nixon tenure. Quote, when Kissinger came to Washington, he told a number of people of his determination to concentrate on matters of general strategy and leave operations to the departments. Some dismissed this as the typical disclaimer of a new White House staff man. Yet, much in Kissinger's writings suggests that his intention to devote himself to broad policy was real. He had repeatedly criticized our government's tendency to treat problems as isolated cases and to identify foreign policy with the solution of immediate issues, rather than developing an interconnected strategy for coping with the world over a period of years. And his emphasis was primarily on problems of decision-making. He defined the problem basically in terms of how to get the government to settle on its major policy priorities and strategy, and had been slow to recognize the difficulty of getting the bureaucracy to implement such a strategy once set. Kissinger found a kindred spirit in a president whose campaigning had denounced the Kennedy-Johnson de-emphasis on formal national security planning in favor of catch-as-catch-can talk fests. And the system he put together for Nixon is designed above all to facilitate and illuminate major presidential foreign policy choices. Well over 100 NSSMs, National Security Study Memoranda, have been issued by the White House to the various foreign affairs government agencies, calling for analysis of major issues and development of realistic alternative policy options on them. These studies are cleared through a network of general interdepartmental committees responsible to Kissinger, and the most important issues they raise are argued out before the President in the National Security Council. Nixon then makes a decision from among the options, usually after further private deliberation." End quote. While the NSC itself may not have met any more frequently under President Nixon than it did during the Kennedy-Johnson regimes, the Council served as an important coordinating mechanism for Dr. Kissinger in centralizing and affirming his control over national security and intelligence matters. As in the Eisenhower period, a variety of auxiliary panels were created for special aspects of security policy. These were chaired by Kissinger and provided staff support by his NSC personnel. The principal auxiliary units, not all, for some undoubtedly were never publicly acknowledged, and a definitive list is not otherwise known to exist, associated with the Council since its creation, are discussed below. On May 10, 1949, President Truman announced the creation of two panels which would flank the NSC structure. The first of these, the Interdepartmental Committee on Internal Security, was chaired initially by the Special Assistant to the Attorney General, with representatives from the Department of State, Defense, and Treasury, as well as the NSC, the last in an advisor-observer capacity. Largely a paper structure, this body has been almost totally inactive during the past decade. Nevertheless, responsibility for its operations currently lies with the head of the Internal Security Section of the Criminal Division, Department of Justice. The Interdepartmental Intelligence Conference, the other unit established by President Truman, was initially headed by J. Edgar Hoover, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and counted among its members the heads of Army, Navy, and Air Force intelligence agencies and an NSC representative, the last, again, in an advisor-observer capacity. Slightly more active than the counterpart Internal Security Panel, the conference has, since the death of Director Hoover, been maintained by a secretariat within the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Both of these entities, one predominantly military and the other largely civilian in scope, are responsible for coordinating certain investigations of domestic espionage, counterespionage, sabotage, subversion, and related internal security matters. Because the differentiation between their jurisdiction is not altogether clear, fundamental disagreements between them over such matters are settled by the NSC. However, in view of the inactivity of these units, it would seem that few disputes over jurisdiction have been taken to the Council recently by these panels. In June 1951, a Psychological Strategy Board was established by presidential directive. Supplanting an earlier board created in the Department of State under Assistant Secretary Edward W. Barrett, the new panel attempted to determine the psychological objectives of the United States and coordinated and evaluated the work of operating psychological warfare agencies. Under the terms of its charter, the board was obligated to report to the National Security Council on its activities and on its evaluation of the national psychological operations, including implementation of approved objectives, policies, and programs by the departments and agencies concerned. Composed of the Undersecretary of State, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and the Director of Central Intelligence, or their designees, and such other representatives as determined by them, the unit was ultimately abolished on September 2, 1953, when Reorganization Plan No. 8 of that year established the United States Information Agency, which assumed the functions of the board. Finding a need for improving the manner in which NSC policies were carried out, President Eisenhower created the Operations Coordinating Board in September 1953, which, after the chief executive approved a policy submitted by the council, was to consult with the agencies involved as to, quote, A, their detailed operational planning responsibilities respecting such policy, B, the coordination of the interdepartmental aspects of the detailed operational plans developed by the agencies to carry out such policy, C, the timely and coordinated execution of such policy and plans, and D, the execution of each security action or project so that it shall make its full contribution to the attainment of national security objectives and to the particular climate of opinion the United States is seeking to achieve in the world, and E, initiate new proposals for action within the framework of national security policies in response to opportunity and changes in the situation." End quote. In addition to the Undersecretary of State, who acted as chairman, the panel consisted of the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Director of Foreign Operations, and the Director of Central Intelligence. The Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs might attend any session of the board on his own volition, and the Director of the United States Information Agency was to advise the body upon request. In his efforts at streamlining the national security structure, President Kennedy terminated the board in February 1961. The 40 Committee, also known as the Special Group, the 5412 Group, and the 303 Committee, was established by a secret NSC Order No. 54/12 and derived from an informal Operations Coordinating Board luncheon group. Created sometime in 1955, the panel has had a varying membership, but has reportedly included the Director of Central Intelligence, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the Secretary and Deputy Secretary of Defense, and during the past decade, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Presidential Assistant for National Security Affairs. During the past 3 administrations, the President's National Security Assistant is thought to have chaired the group's sessions. According to one authority, it is this unit which makes policies which walk the tightrope between peace and war. Another source credits the committee with holding authority on the execution of CIA clandestine operations. Footnote: Victor Marchetti and John D. Marks, The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence, New York, Alfred A. Knopp, 1974, pages 325 through 327. This currently controversial account of Central Intelligence Agency and Foreign Intelligence Community operations contains the most recent and detailed publicly available statistical estimates regarding federal intelligence resources. End footnote. In this latter regard, the group functions as a shield against claims that the chief executive directly approved some morally questionable clandestine activity. This function of the panel would not, however, seem to excuse the president from his constitutional obligation to, quote, take care that the laws be faithfully executed, end quote. Footnote: see U.S. Congress, Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities. Alleged assassination plots involving foreign leaders. Committee print, 94th Congress, First Session. Washington, U.S. Government Print Office, 1975, pages 9 through 13. End footnote. With the arrival of the Nixon administration in 1969, Dr. Kissinger instituted 3 new NSC coordinating mechanisms. The Undersecretaries Committee, initially headed by Undersecretary of State John N. Irwin, was originally designed as the chief implementing body to carry out many, but not all, presidential NSC directives. But according to a 1971 evaluation, the panel's actual importance, never very great, continues to lapse. Quote, another is the Senior Review Group, now, 1971, at an undersecretary level and chaired by Kissinger, which usually gives final approval to the NSC study memoranda after making sure that all realistic alternatives are presented. End quote. The third entity, the Washington Special Actions Group, included as members, as of late 1971, the Attorney General, the Director of Central Intelligence, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. It functions as top-level operations center for sudden crises and emergencies. On November 5, 1971, the White House announced additional reorganization efforts with regard to the intelligence community, the net outcome of which was the establishment of 3 more NSC panels. Quote, a National Security Council Intelligence Committee, chaired by the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. Its members include the Attorney General, the DCI, Director of Central Intelligence, the Undersecretary of State, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The committee will give direction and guidance on national intelligence needs and provide for a continuing evaluation of intelligence products from the viewpoint of the intelligence user. A net assessment group within the National Security Council staff. The group is headed by a senior staff member and is responsible for reviewing and evaluating all intelligence products and for producing net assessments. An Intelligence Resources Advisory Committee, chaired by the DCI, including as members a senior representative from the Department of State, the Department of Defense, the Office of Management and Budget, and the Central Intelligence Agency. This committee advises the DCI on the preparation of a consolidated intelligence program budget. End quote. Footnote. See Weekly Compilation of Presidential Documents, V7, November 8, 1971. End footnote. These units, together with the above-named groups and the verification panel, which is responsible for monitoring the intelligence related to the strategic arms limitation talks and is chaired by Dr. Kissinger, constitute the major NSC affiliates of interest to this study. Unless otherwise noted, all of these entities are officially operative, though in some instances they exhibit little functional activity. This is Our Hidden History